Welcome to the State of Affairs in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago and Intelligencer Today. I am very honored to have a dear friend back with us again, Colonel Doug Macgregor, who does not need that much introduction. Welcome back.
Well, that's good because, most people don't remember those introductions anyway. So I'm glad we're
But people do remember you and people know who you are and they watch your interviews. They watch it globally. I know because I do have access to many satellite programs. So your views have been very popular because you are very realistic about what is happening in the world. I'd like to start with something that is now a hot topic. Tucker Carlson, who you know personally, who has gone to Moscow to interview Vladimir Putin. What is your take on that?
Well, I think we need to recognize that Tucker is a very courageous individual to do this. And I think that he's had thus far something in the neighborhood of 120 million views as they track this across the internet, which is a good thing. He needed to do it, but I don't think anybody else but Tucker Carlson could have done it. But keep in mind, he's under severe threat here for having done so.
Yes.
And I think the machinery of government will be employed against him in some fashion. It's inevitable. They're very bitter. Let's be frank. Everybody knows the truth, but nobody speaks it in Washington, D.C. The truth is not popular. The truth is Ukraine is finished. It's in ruins. The business about more money for Ukraine has a lot to do with maintaining the facade that there's still something there. And at the same time, to sort of wash money through the usual laundering process that ends up in the pockets of donors and constituents and the defense industries and back on the Hill. It doesn't have a lot to do with Ukraine. I mean, some of the money goes directly there to pay the government, pay the army. Now, how much of that really reaches anybody? I'm so tired of reading about brigade commanders and battalion commanders who keep people on the rolls who are dead because they want to pocket cash that comes in to pay them in the field. And this, of course, deprives widows and relatives of any cash they might otherwise get from the government. I mean, the place wallows in a sea of corruption to the point of being nauseating. But in Washington, D.C., the place where nobody speaks the truth and we are always victorious and successful, no one will admit that the war is lost. So it was good for Tucker to at least talk to President Putin. I think we got a glimpse of things, which I think on the whole were more positive than negative of President Putin. A lot of Americans did not understand his determination to talk about 1,000 years of Russian history.
Yes.
But remember, Henry Ford summed up the American attitude towards history. All history is bunk, is what Henry Ford said. And that's the American attitude. Whatever happened 2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, or 2 decades ago doesn't matter. It's only what's going on right now. This has gotten us into a lot of trouble. So I think it was a good thing. He certainly did a great job on the Tsarist history. He upset me somewhat because he glossed over the tens of millions of human beings murdered by communism beginning in 1918.
Yes.
He didn't bother to talk about any of that. He tried to create this illusion that everything was Adolf Hitler's idea. Complete failure to understand, to even mention Stalin's role and the role of communism. Frankly, if you go back and look at Hitler's rise to power, it was largely in response to fear of communism.
Yes.
He was seen in Germany as the only one who could stand up to it and prevent Germany from falling into the hands of communists. And of course, Stalin was only too eager to jump on board and invade Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Eastern Poland. And there was no discussion of the 1.5 million Poles that disappeared in Eastern Poland and various peoples that disappeared in the Baltic states as well, and Finland's losses. That was the only thing that bothered me, because I really do believe that at some point Russia has to come to terms with this.
Yes.
It's never really been through this arduous, gut-wrenching process of understanding just how terrible that period of life was. But now, having said that, if I had been in his shoes, or if he had asked me for my opinion, I would have said, don't waste your time talking about anything that happened before 1991. and start with 1992, emphasize that Russia is not a communist country. It's not a communist society. It has rediscovered its Russian Orthodox Christian roots.
Mm-hmm.
The society is a very healthy society, and Russia is booming economically. Now,
Yes.
that's not because of anything we've done. We've done everything we could to harm Russia. And then he could talk about, how it has failed and why it has failed. He didn't do that. He did some of it. He did recount what happened in the lead up to 2022 February and the intervention. And I think he was somewhat successful there. I think the most successful part, though, was when he talked about the nature of the Russian soul.
Mm-hmm.
And he depicted the Russian people as a spiritual society. And even though he was asked, do you think you see the hand of providence or God behind things? And I don't speak Russian. I don't know how that was translated. I don't know how his comments were translated. And he said rather flippantly, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I really think he was talking about that. But he was also talking about interests, the interests of Russia, the interests of other states in Europe. On the whole, I think it was a tremendous success, because here's a man who is almost 71, who speaks fluidly without the need of any notes. No one has to whisper in his ear what he should or shouldn't say or what he needs to know. And he has a sense of humor. That was evident.
Yes.
He laughed over certain things, especially the question about artificial intelligence, which I thought was a great response. I mean, why are we wasting hot air on that subject here? So I think on the whole, he did extremely well. Anybody who bothers to look at him, listen to him, and then compare him with the people in the West has got to be very disappointed in what we have in the West.
Exactly.
There's nobody like that. And that's a real comment on the system, I think, that we have versus what they do. Whether you like the way they govern doesn't make much difference. And that's something else that I hope got through to people. We need to stop meddling in other people's affairs. And he sort of obliquely said that. You've got your own problems at home. What are you doing in Ukraine? What are your interests here? Why would you be bothered? And he made that point. We don't need to meddle in other people's affairs, and how they govern themselves is ultimately their business. We need to start developing or cultivating a respect for other people, their cultures, their way of life, their thinking. Stop pretending that everyone everywhere is the same. And most important, stop pretending that our quote unquote values are the values that should be universal. In other words, that we somehow or another have captured permanently the moral high ground. It's kind of funny when you stop and think about it. Here's Putin, who is a Russian, who is making all of these valid points. And on the other side of the table sits Tucker, who's not really representing the government. I think he's a good representative of the American people.
Yes.
We have a government that sounds more like the old Soviet regime than any American government, because it brooks no opposition. It refuses all debate. It suppresses all dissent. It's bizarre. In other words, somehow or another, Russia emerged from 70 years of sort of degenerate communism in a healthier state of mind than we have today in the United States, and we successfully avoided that.
Tables have certainly turned. I'd like your opinion on the history lesson, because you are an avid historian, somebody who really appreciates other cultures, histories. You know this, and you are one of those rare people who can speak about history with a lot of credibility. I feel that part went over people's heads, because deliberately we are being dumbed down. We don't learn history, as you noted yourself. But given that Russia and many Slavic countries essentially operate within that framework of long histories, of thousands of years of history, unlike us who operate maybe within 200-300 years of our own history, but we are actively working on dismantling even what we have, and what I think is very proud history of our United States of America. Is that the stark contrast between East and West? in geopolitical terms, maybe that to me seemed like a fundamental difference between how East and West essentially operates geopolitically, diplomatically, in policy, in terms of politics in general. Do you see that at all?
I think he was trying to make the point that the Russian state has existed since 932 without going into the details of every conceivable war or campaign that's ever been fought or whatever the specific achievements have been of the Russian people, which are substantial. His point was, we've been here since 932. We are still here, and we will be here for another 1,000 years. I think that's really what his message was. I don't know that most Americans understood that, but I certainly did. But I remember in 1968, I was on my first trip to Europe. I was 15, and my grandfather gave me this trip to Europe with him as a birthday present. And he was very shocked about where I wanted to go. But I ended up spending most of the time in Germany, what was then Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, and Austria.
Mm-hmm.
Strangely enough. But I had just taken some German in school, and I walked past the U.S. Embassy, and there were placards out in front of the U.S. Embassy showing damage that we were doing in Vietnam. This is 1968. And standing next to me was a Hungarian who came by and looked at the pictures, and I asked him in my sort of school German at the time, "What do you think about that?" And he sort of shrugged his shoulders, and said he was skeptical. And I said, "Well, what about Hungary? What's going to happen here? When do you think the Soviets will leave?" And he said something that I will never forget, which was very reminiscent of Putin's statement, only it's made in a somewhat different way.
Mm-hmm.
He said, we Hungarians have been here for a long time. The Turks were here for 300 years. They are gone. We are still here. When the Soviets are gone, we will still be here.
Yes.
And that's the same message. And that is something that we have difficulty understanding because we're so young.
Yeah.
And we've changed dramatically. Our national identity, our national character, the things that we, as you point out, are proud of, is being diluted deliberately to the point where those of us who call ourselves Americans are viewing themselves increasingly as minorities inside their own country. That it's good to be anything other than an American. It's sort of nationalism in reverse. We are being denationalized. I don't understand why more of us are not more angry and upset. But I think part of that is our prosperity. We have lived so well for so long. We've lost sight of what it took to build up the scientific industrial base, the agriculture, the whole nation. And we're even now we're living militarily on the legacy of the Cold War. There are a few new technologies that have shown up, but the notion that we have fundamentally kept pace with change in the world, in international relations, and in military power, we haven't. We're woefully behind. And one of the things I keep asking is, do you think we've learned anything from what we've seen in Ukraine? Mm-hmm. And people privately say, well, there's a lot to be learned, but to be truthful with you, Doug, no, I don't think we are. And I think that's a problem right now. I mean, somebody sent me this note about the Ukrainians had managed to do damage to a landing ship in the Black Sea, a Russian ship, and said, what do you think about this? Do you think anybody's paying attention? And I said, well, if you're talking about the United States Navy's surface fleet, the answer is no. We still want to continue to build the same ship designs, oversized vessels that are simply large targets, that if they're not sunk, they'll simply be neutralized, or they'll be so vulnerable that they'll sail so far away from the shore that they will be of no real use anymore in a conflict or a crisis. I don't think we're really learning those lessons. And I was just reading something about this Mike Turner on the Intelligence Committee, who apparently is out there arguing that we have this great threat that everybody needs to know about, and presumably it emanates from Russia. Gee, what a surprise. and this is some new super weapon about which we've heard nothing. So this is sort of nonsense that I think is just sort of repackaged and remarketed over and over and over again. I really wonder when Americans are going to wake up. I don't think we have yet, and maybe we're going to wake up the hard way. I hope not.
Well, so with this new package of a lot of money, billions of dollars that they have just voted to send to Ukraine yet again, Putin, obviously, President Putin and Russia in general, they will not lose this war at any cost.
Yeah.
And he has stated that they are ready to negotiate if we stop sending weapons and helping Ukraine, essentially. That deal was on the table. He also mentioned and noted that Boris Johnson, acting on our behalf, stopped that deal. Where do you see this going at this point, given that we are in an election year? When does this stop?
Well, keep in mind that a lot of the equipment that would theoretically show up in Ukraine won't show up for at least a year. I mean, our war stocks are really depleted. There's very little left. We don't have a great deal to send to Ukraine right now. So what they're really doing is they're allocating money to the defense industries to build things for the future. Well, of course, we all know by the time this material arrives, it's not going to make any difference to the outcome in Ukraine. Now, I think President Putin must know that. Surely his intelligence services have made him aware of that fact. So that's the first point. Second point is, I hope he understands that at least for the moment, and presumably at least until well after the next election, he has nobody to talk to in Washington.
Yes.
So he might as well abandon that for all intents and purposes, figure out what it is that he wants to do, and then sit down with the Europeans. And I would place, if I were in charge, my priority would be the Finns, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Poles, Slovaks, Hungarians, Moldovans, Romanians, and Germans. I kicked the Germans in there because I think the Germans are really closing in on the nightmare of deindustrialization.
Yes.
And their shelves in the stores that used to be filled with products that depend on agriculture from the Ukraine and Russia are empty. And the fertilizer that is necessary is not on hand. Not just the cheap energy that fueled the scientific industrial machinery. It's going to reach a point where the Germans are going to suddenly say stop, and it'll be hard reverse. I think I can't predict exactly when, but this will also coincide with the dissolution of NATO. Because the Germans and the Russians, what people don't understand is that historically, conflict between them is anomalous.
Yes, it is.
It's not the natural state of affairs. World War I was an utterly foolish, stupid mistake that Europe and civilization paid a terrible price for. Sadly, because of our meddling and interference, all the wrong people came to power, and we know the rest of the story. The Second World War almost destroyed us. So I think we're reaching a new point in history in which people are going to say, no, wait a minute. We've been listening to all of this nonsense about the Russians. It's nonsense. It's not true. And this is not going to get anywhere unless we change our thinking and our approach. And I think that will happen in Central East Europe. I'm a little concerned about the new government in Poland, which I think is behaving badly. But I don't think they'll last because this is not a Polish government, in my judgment. This is some sort of EU transplant or artificial construct. This is not an expression of the Polish people's needs or aspirations. They're about to be subjected to some of the same insanity that has afflicted most of Western Europe. I don't think the Poles are going to go along with it. I'm giving them more credit than other people do, but I really don't think they will. Because again, you can also point to Poland and Hungary as two examples of major states that have played a critical role in European history. And they too have gotten along and understood each other and worked well together. I think Poland will eventually go the way of Hungary. I don't see any evidence that Hungary is going to turn around and march into the West European camp ever. So I think all of the things that we have taken for granted, certainly since the end of the Second World War, are collapsing. they're all going to vanish. And when they do, new things will emerge, and they're going to emerge largely without the United States. And Russia will be a beneficiary because the Russians will finally have people they can talk to and people with whom they can do business. I think that's an absolute certainty. The real question is, how do things sort out in the Balkans? And the Balkans is once again a powder keg.
Yes, it is.
It has always been one, but this is serious, more serious than Americans realize. And I don't see any will or determination in the West to go in and punish Serbs. Now, they may talk a great game. I don't see it happening. And I don't see the other European powers joining in on a pulverize the Serb campaign. I just don't see it. So there may be an opportunity to sort that child out differently. You know, Russia has risen in power and strength and influence. The United States is declining. Now, this is not a permanent state of affairs. Look at Russia in 1991. Look at Russia today. Who would have thought within 30, 32, 33 years that it would rise like a phoenix? Well, a lot of that can be attributed to Vladimir Putin. Let's face it. I mean, he absolutely, with an iron fist, he didn't always make all the right decisions, but he made enough of them that Russia has recovered its status. We are making all the wrong decisions and shooting ourselves in the foot. And as I've tried to tell Americans for years, we did not win the Cold War. The Soviets lost it. You know, they failed on their own. They were going to fail, as Kennan said, one way or another. Well, right now we're failing, not for any reason to do with Russia or China or Iran or anybody else. We're failing because of the suicidal policies that we've adopted. That's clear to me. So I don't think we're permanently out of the game, but we've effectively taken ourselves out. And I don't know how long we can hang in the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East is a strange place. You know, the people that rule the Saudi Arabia and the other Arabian states in the peninsula, they're very different from their populations. Their populations see what's happening in Gaza and they are enraged. The Egyptians are enraged about what's happening in Gaza. The people in Jordan are enraged about what's happening in Gaza. General Sisi doesn't want a war. Neither does King Abdullah. In fact, I don't see anybody in the region that wants a war. But I think populations are rising. And if something isn't done about what's going on in Gaza, I think many of the regimes will be toppled.
Well, Turkish people are very aware, but do you think all of them will have the power to actually move the line and to do something about it? Because as you said, the elite in those nations don't want war, but the populations are painfully aware of what is happening. What do you think is going to be the outcome of this?
You know, a friend of mine who's Turkish sent me a long diatribe talking about the fragility of the Turkish economy and arguing that on the grounds that the Turkish economy is indeed fragile, inflation is a problem, the middle class is suffering and so forth, a war would be disastrous. And therefore Erdogan, will do anything he can to avoid it. I think he probably will. The question is, are we all exclusively economic animals, which of course is the Marxist view of the world? We have no souls. What we are is irrelevant as people, our culture, our identities, our languages, way of life. We're just fungible material. That's the Marxist view. And unfortunately, that's very popular here in the United States, as you know. I don't think the people of the Middle East fall into that category. I think this is very meaningful to them. So I think you could see things change in Egypt in a week. Also in Jordan. Now, once those things begin to happen, others in the region may follow. And of course, we haven't talked about Iran and Hezbollah and the various Shiite organizations in Iraq and Syria. They are not to be dismissed easily.
Absolutely.
And,
that was my question, if I may. Wall Street Journal, from what I understand, Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo penned an op-ed, joint op-ed, that says we must strike Iran. Will we go that far to strike Iran?
I've thought for a long time that we would, simply because there's so much money invested in promoting war with Iran. I mean, there is nothing the Israelis would like better than to see us in a full-fledged war with Iran. I think 30 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, had that happened, the Israelis might have gotten more of what they wanted. Today, if it happens, it will be a disaster for us and for them.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Russians, the Chinese, I would argue the Indians, others in Asia have ties and interests to what happens in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, what happens in Turkey, in the Mediterranean. And as a result, this could look more like a World War I scenario than many people think. Now, World War I, as you know, 28 June, we had the assassination. We're at full-fledged war by the end of July, beginning of August. This is taking longer.
Yes.
But the assassination is effectively Gaza. And the question is, will anybody do anything about the assassination in Gaza? And you have the usual collection of people. Some say, oh, we don't want to be bothered. It's an irritant. It's unnecessary. It doesn't affect us. But I don't think that's what most people in the Middle East think. I don't think that's what the Turks think. And the Iranians, frankly, who are probably the least interested in the Sunni Muslim Arabs, actually are taking this very seriously. They understand the broader implications. So the real issue is it's a powder keg. What's the match? Who's got it? Who's going to light it first? How is it going to be lit? I don't know. But I think Gavril Princip, after he was arrested, said, even if I had done nothing, this war would still have happened.
Yes.
And you can make a case that that's probably true. It may have happened differently, but you probably would have gotten it. I think we're in a similar position right now. This regional war that the elites don't want, but the populations will demand, is going to happen. And of course, the Israelis have to be watched very carefully, because what has their answer been to every challenge? Escalation. Somebody said to me the other day, good friend who lives in Israel, and he said, just imagine, Douglas, if on 7 October, after this horrific event occurred, the Israelis had said, stop. Don't do anything. Let's gather together the leaders in the region and examine what has happened and look for a solution. I said, well, that's an interesting idea. And, remember that at that point, there were still good relations between Israel and most of its Arab neighbors in the peninsula. You still had Erdogan, who was striving to be some sort of intermediary in the negotiating process. You still had the goodwill at that point of the Russians, Chinese, and others who looked upon what happened in 7 October as unacceptable, objectionable, and horrific. But it didn't happen. Instead, we got the overreaction that went way beyond what was reasonable, just as the Austrians did not need to start a war with Serbia. The Serbs looked at all the demands they made, and they got virtually everything they asked for except one thing, which nobody could ever accept, which is, we're going to come into your country and conduct the investigations and arrest people. No, we can't do that. We did the same thing to the Spaniards, by the way, during the Spanish-American War. We sent them an ultimatum, and they gave us virtually everything we wanted. And then we said, fine, we're going to go to war. That's kind of what I think the Israelis are doing now. They could have had a lot. Now I think they've pushed it so hard, so far, so fast. There's no room for any sort of compromise. And the memory is going to be so strained and so scarred that it will last for centuries. So I see a regional war coming. I just don't know when it happens.
They are all essentially overplaying their hand. But you said something interesting to me the other day, because I asked you about the State Department deciding to send javelins to Kosovo. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned something to me about the cartels getting them from Ukraine. Can you comment on that?
Well, all I can tell you is what I know, and I don't have access to the special intelligence, but I've seen photographs and read reports provided to me, translated from Spanish into English, and the photographs show cartel members with the javelin system on their backs. So they have the systems down there. And remember that it's not just for potential use against us per se. They're busy killing each other because profits are enormous. I just learned that as of today, 112,000 people last year died of fentanyl poisoning. I mean, we inched from 90 up to 100,000 for several years, and now it's 112 and growing, and yet there is no interest in doing anything about the border. I mean, the money is there. There is no will in Washington, which is very interesting if you stop and think about it. Now, are there some people that would do something? Of course, but some doesn't count when the overwhelming majority, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, refuse to act. So we have a government that refuses to enforce our laws, a government that refuses to protect our population, but wants to invest heavily in perpetuating the myth that Ukraine is a real country and can survive what it's just been through, which I don't think it will. And at the same time, the new myth that Israel is defending itself. Israel is conducting a war of mass murder and expulsion in Gaza that affects 2.1 million Arabs, Muslims, and Christians. And again, as I think I mentioned to you earlier, a journalist called me and said, "We're really, really baffled by your position on Israel." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, you've always been a big supporter. What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, if there were an operation to kill 2.1 million Jews in Israel, I would be opposed.
Absolutely.
And there's an operation to kill or destroy 2.1 million Arabs, and I'm opposed. I can't applaud this as something good and beneficial for mankind. But that's lost here inside the Beltway. No one sees it in those terms. Of course, there's no incentive to see it in those terms. It's much more lucrative to be on the other side and cheered on, which is happening.
Well, no one seems to care about the thousands of Slavic Christian lives that are also being lost in Russia or in Ukraine, but also Russians are losing their lives as well.
Well, I thought that Putin, in an interesting way, made the point that there would be a reconciliation of the two peoples because they are essentially both Slavic Christians, Orthodox Christians. The wounds would be bound up and we would go forward. I hope he's right. I think so, as long as people in the West do not intervene to disrupt it and stop it. Because what we have now in Ukraine is a deeply wounded individual. If you look at it from the standpoint of a human being, this is a wounded person. The wound is going to fester for years. It's not going to heal anytime soon. But it has no chance of healing if people are going to continue to pour salt in it on a routine basis. And that's my concern. Too many people in the intelligence communities, the military, and the leadership in Washington will want to, in their overwrought imaginations, harm Russia by continuing to make the Ukrainians miserable.
And in turn, we are harming ourselves, and Europeans certainly are harming themselves.
I think the Europeans will figure it out before we do.
One last thing, because you did mention that the Balkans seems like a powder keg yet again. And with this business of javelins being sent to Kosovo to essentially into the hands of the terrorists, what do you see happening there?
If weapons are provided to the Kosovars and there is a conflict or crisis, they will use them. There's no question about it. And the population living in Kosovo will be hard-pressed to defend itself. So I would think that the president of Serbia or whoever is currently running Serbia should sit down with, first of all, his counterpart in both Kosovo and I would argue in Tirana in Albania, and say, look, none of us are blind. Even a blind man could see where this is headed. So we need to stop it. How are we going to do it? Now, if you didn't have the United States sort of cowering over Serbia and the region the way it does, to ensure that its little artificial construct that was built upon wishful thinking back in the 1990s and then again in 1999 and 2000 survives, if that were not the case, you don't know what could happen. Something could be arranged. Who knows? This is where Russia comes in, because Russia is now a force. Nobody questions that. If anybody wondered whether or not Russia was a great power, that question has been answered. And everybody knows who has historically managed the real estate in the Balkans. That's Russia.
Mm.
Russia spent a lot of blood and treasure liberating people in the Balkans from the Ottoman Turks. And I think that figures prominently in Vladimir Putin's thinking. So I suspect that that's a game changer. And I doubt seriously that the United States wants to confront Russia over the Balkans. So I'm hopeful that instead of getting another pointless confrontation, that we could get some sort of arrangement with which everybody can live. But right now, that's not of any interest whatsoever in Washington. Washington is feeding the fire. You know, it's sort of like the fire didn't go out ever, as we both know, Kosovo or Bosnia. Now the embers are being fed oxygen, and some people want to throw gasoline on it. So the question is, how do you get around that? And I think the only way to get around it is if the Russians make the point that they won't tolerate that.
Fascinating. Colonel Macgregor, as always, wonderful, wonderful insight. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Olga.